Hey, everybody. This is Mike. Before we start this episode, just a quick content note. In this episode, we do discuss accounts of child sex abuse. So if that's something you want to skip, feel free to skip this episode. All right. That said, let's start the show. Meanwhile, there is a cult that worships this marker and worships these aliens as the next stage of human evolution. And that cult was founded by an anthropologist named Michael Altman.
No.
Yes.
Welcome to Cult Favorite, where we will never ask you to sign an NDA. I'm Merinda Simmons.
I am Mike Altman.
You had to think about it for
I
a
had
second.
to think, yeah.
It's because there's a lot of heavy topics coming into this one. So we are going with part 2 of the Hillsong documentary that has 4 episodes on Hulu, The Secrets of Hillsong. Last time we talked about the first 2 episodes where we get introduced to Hillsong as a religious but also pop culture and media phenomenon, specifically Carl Lentz, the head pastor at Hillsong, New York City, who had the deep V's, the very sexy tight jeans, all of
The obliques.
the obliques, the quality time with Justin Bieber. And so he was the pastor. He had this spectacular fall from his position after multiple affairs, information about which came out. Church calls an emergency meeting, and he is let go. We get into his relationship with his wife, all of that. So we get introduced to the church, some of its members, and the Lentz family. But now the documentary really shifts into a broader look at Hillsong's beginnings, where it came from, what kinds of ideology were really important to its rise, what kinds of attitudes and practices were proliferating at Hillsong College, and what kinds of things were going on behind the scenes in the church across lots of kinds of misdeeds. So we won't get into the nitty-gritty about tons of the details, but I want to do like some broad stroke stuff and think about how it is and why it is that structural information still becomes more folded into a story about an individual, whether hero or martyr or villain or fill-in archetype here.
What do we how do we need to spoil this for people who haven't seen it yet so that we can, so what happens in these 2 episodes?
Okay.
What do we need to know?
In these 2 episodes, we learn about Frank Houston, who's Brian Houston's father. Frank Houston was a pastor in the Assemblies of God for a long, long time before he moved to Sydney and started a church in the late 70s that would eventually become Hillsong. We learn about the fact that he had for decades been a serial child predator and sexually assaulted multiple people across his time, like dating back to when he was in his 20s. We learn about the fact that Brian, when he starts to come into leadership roles in Hillsong, what becomes Hillsong, learns about these things, doesn't do anything about them. Frank Houston continues to carry prestige in the church, even though he quietly resigns. And we also learn about the silence surrounding this serial sexual abuse. And we also learn about the kinds of culture of shame and domination and exploitation that were happening inside the church, but also inside the college, what people were asked to reveal about their own lives. So there's something about like the actual crimes committed by Frank Houston, the culture that emerges in the church and its ancillary spaces, and the kind of leadership style then that Brian carries on into building Hillsong as this mega global corporate brand that we talked about more last time. We're going to learn later about Brian's own sexual misdeeds and financial sketchiness, and that's.
So
I think
it's a story of a terrible father and son, and
that's correct.
And how they built a global church that then covered up their terribleness.
How this horrible but dynamic duo became a global mega brand.
And it's an interesting there's almost in the episode 3 and then kind of into episode 4, there's almost like a 3-act play built into the larger story of like Brian's rise, and then all of the skeletons in his father's closet that then lead to the downfall, that also lead to his own skeletons coming out. And so and then that's and then I think we could talk some more about the way that it's sort of at the end is sort of asking us to compare these two men and Carl Lentz and Brian Houston.
It is very much a documentary about men. Although you mentioned something in our conversations before we started recording about the fact that patriarchy is never a word uttered in the entirety of the documentary series, which I think is such an important blind spot or a conspicuous absence.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's when the entire some would say theological, but I would say ideological. When the entire ideological thing is just built on masculinity and heteronormativity, I mean, it's like it would be like saying that my house is made out of wood. Like, yeah, it's a house. Like, it's a house. That's what it's made out of. Like, this is literally the building blocks. And so, but I think by not saying it and by the variety of ways that it gets whitewashed, for lack of a better term, it goes unmarked until it isn't. Like we talked last episode about, it's not until Canfield is going on Survivor that suddenly being gay is an issue, and they have to drop this big, this statement for the whole global church about it. So it's until it's just there, and then eventually it's like, oh, they're not actually progressive, or oh, there's women on stage, but they're always standing next to a man or whatever.
So I think that stories about personas are always tidier and easier to tell and more palatable to who's hearing them than stories about structures. So in this case, we've got the persona of Carl Lentz or Brian Houston or Frank Houston for that matter, but we don't have patriarchy. That's such a harder conversation to have, because then you have 20 gazillion things to talk about. And part of what I think is so important about the conversation that we're trying to have and why we wanted to do this podcast in the first place is paying attention to the stories that we are telling about these super complicated structures. And of course, they are stories about people and the people involved with other people, but they are also stories about these more complex things. And so one of those complex things that I think gets packaged in a very tidy way that is so fundamental to how and why Hillsong became the brand that it did, and how and why it fostered certain kinds of abuses and silences surrounding those abuses is something called the prosperity gospel. And I'm wondering if you can kind of give us a nutshell about what prosperity gospel is, how it emerged, what do you
Yeah.
think about when you think about prosperity gospel?
Welcome to Mike Pretends to Be a Historian. Yeah, and I think it's funny the context that it comes up in is still in this narrative of persona, right? So it comes up in the documentary in the story of how Brian Houston goes from skinny mustached 70s pastor in very 70s blue carpeted church.
They were part of the Assemblies of God
Yeah.
denomination, which was still relatively blue collar ish in Australia at the
Yeah.
time, anyway.
And then by the 90s he's slick headed you know, alpha male
Oh,
sort of
he did like a
power
little Bruce
pastor.
Willis transformation.
Yeah, no, it's
Hmm.
I don't know what was Bruce Willis's transformation.
Well, when he shaved his head, he became like,
I don't know a pre-shaved Bruce Willis.
oh, well,
I think the earliest Bruce Willis I know is Pulp Fiction Bruce Willis,
I
which I
mean,
recently made my partner watch, and she was
let
horrified that I watched it in high school.
let me invite you to Google image, my friend.
Hold on. It wouldn't be a podcast if we weren't doing live Googling.
But Frank Houston
Bruce
goes
Willis
on.
with hair. Hold on.
Frank Houston is hanging out in Sydney. Brian Houston becomes part of the main leadership and then goes to the United States where he meets all sorts of people. And he comes back, at least to his friends and colleagues' accounting, a changed man. And that's when he kind of like adopts prosperity gospel.
Okay, he had hair in Pulp and Die Hard.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess he did
Not a mustache, but
not a mustache. Well, no, and that so Brian Houston goes to get some experiences the prosperity gospel in the late 80 in 89 and which by the way the scene of like this is what America was like in the late 80s was amazing. And yeah, so at that point the prosperity gospel has its roots kind of both within American Christianity and without. So Norman Vincent Peale's book, The Power of Positive Thinking, which is exactly what you think it is. That book was sort of the first one to kind of bring this into a kind of Christian theology. That was in 1952.
that's like a if you think it, it will come, right?
Yeah,
Like you manifest
yeah.
something, manifest
Yes.
as a, yeah.
So the idea that human thought has the power to change reality around someone has a long, I mean, Christian Science in the 19th century going forward, a group of things called New Thought. If you want a wild time, look that up. Some of my, so it's got a long history, both sort of adjacent to sort of the mainstreams of American Christianity, but then Peale kind of pulls it all together. And Peale himself was a pastor of a church in New York, and it was actually Marblehead, or Marble, excuse me, not Marblehead, Marble Collegiate Church. And
It's because you're still thinking about the hair.
I am, yeah, no, but it's actually the church that Donald Trump grew up in as a boy.
Fun fact.
Yeah. And he actually also, Peale famously, he was one of the staunchly anti-Catholic, and really opposed JFK and all this stuff. But so Peale kind of pulls it in the mainstream middle, like 1950s America, and makes it something that's going to appeal to kind of suburban audiences. At the same time, you have the Pentecostal tradition that starts at the turn of the century that begins as a kind of very working class and urban movement and then spreads into rural parts of, starts in California, eventually makes its way east, spreads into some of the more stereotypical places you see Pentecostalism, like, in the mountains of Appalachia or whatever. And the thing about that movement is it's very much about that God does stuff like in the here and now. So like speaking in tongues, the go-to example of Pentecostalism, which they do they don't put it in front facing, but they do as part of Hillsong, you find out. That was an idea of like the Holy Spirit is right here. Here's proof I'm speaking in tongues, right? As opposed to say other forms of Christianity in the United States where it was like, I don't know where God really is, so I'm going to like write a long diary entry thinking about whether I've sinned or not.
Right, or also like I know I've memorized or read or studied this liturgy or this ancient
Yeah,
text or
right.
this kind of what it's about. It's much more relational, right?
Yeah,
Like
exactly. Yeah. And so um that here and now message, and the best place to go find the story is Kate Bowler's book Blessed. Kate, I hope you're listening to this.
we can link it.
Yeah, we'll put that in show notes. But but long story short, these two kind of streams of the power of positive thinking and manifesting your own reality run into the here and now spirituality of Pentecostalism. And you get this thing that says, like, God wants to bless you and bless you here, and your health and your wealth, the sort of health wealth gospel, is a sign that you are being blessed. And so, and a sign that you're right with God. And then what that also leads to is, how do you achieve that blessing? Well, friend, you should invest in God's kingdom. And here's how. Here's a 1-800 number. Here's an envelope that you can send things to. Here's an address. Send the pastor, the pastor says, send us this thing. We invest in the kingdom. You will be blessed by God. And so it is this language of kind of financial investment, spiritual investment in terms of like having faith and attending and being a part. And, if you have enough faith, then you will be healthy. If you have enough faith, you will be wealthy. And so it is ripe for this is why Brian Houston, if he's going to do prosperity gospel, can't look like Ned Flanders anymore. He has to look like the kind of person who's been blessed and has power, right? And like, it doesn't show up in Hillsong or in Houston, but this can also be connected to like physical healing and like, and this idea of like of being sort of a conduit, the pastor, the leader as a conduit through whom sort of God's blessings flow. And if you fall out of favor with them, well, you're out of favor with God, which could have all sorts of consequences. So there are a variety of flavors of prosperity gospel. I mean, there have been women who have led prosperity congregations with great aplomb and success. But what Houston, when he decides to go down that route, we don't get a lot of explanation of like what that looks like. It's like he showed up in America and saw like, I don't know, like cocaine and dance clubs and decided this is what I can do this. But that move, his like, it's sort of on the nose. Like the book that he publishes after this is like, you need more money. It's like, yes.
It's called that?
Yeah, that's the title.
Oh,
You
wow.
need more money. Yes,
I mean-
yes, I do. Thank you, sir.
I will not disagree with you.
We're not talking about like stewardship or whatever, and I think it carries with it the need for the persona. So now I need that motorcycle, I need that Versace tie, I need that, and it sort of sets this sort of it's also a kind of aspirational thing. It's why someone like, I remember a few years ago, like Creflo Dollar, who's another prosperity, he's like, everybody give me money so I can buy a plane. And like people outside the church are like, what?
Right.
Like, what does he need a plane? But it's the idea that like, well, if he gets the plane, that's the sign of blessing. And that's a sign of like, I want to be the one that God wants to give a plane to.
Because you're investing in the kingdom. You're not investing in, or it's an incredible, I mean, it's such a brilliant bit of rhetorical or performance gymnastics, because we get so invested in the persona of this person. Like you say, they have to have certain clothes and they have to kind of have a certain vibe. And there's so we get so attached to what then, cut to cult documentary where it's called charisma. But we also, like, the members of these churches are, when they give the kind of money to those charismatic individuals, it's not because they think Creflo Dollar really needs a plane. It's because that plane is signifying or reflective of a bigger plan or a bigger project that God has to advance the kingdom in this
Yeah.
way or that way in the here and now, like you were talking about.
The way I've heard it from a different Hillsong adjacent megachurch pastor is at that sort of offering moment is heaven and hell are real places, so give so we can grow the kingdom. Like that's literally the language. And so when we talk about when they talk about growing the kingdom, it is based on this idea that you to not do this would be to let people and I think we'll keep coming back to this across all sorts of documentaries where it's either the fear of hell or the hope of something else that is sort of central to these things. And I think this is another, in the background of this, it is like you don't do this unless there's some consequence for not doing it. And if it's a consequence that no one can prove, even better.
Yeah.
So that's prosperity gospel, and it is what I think for in the Hillsong case, it's not like Hillsong is a prosperity church. Like if you asked, some of the like almost most lists of these sort of prosperity preachers is like a Creflo Dollar. It's a lot of the televangelists. It's Jim and Tammy Faye Baker. It's all these books, but that it is sort of baked in, much like patriarchy. It's sort of in the background. It's in the logic of how they think about money, how they think about and what drives this sort of aspirational persona of like the pastor has to be the kind of man that you either want to be or want to marry.
The link that Kristen Dumez is a religious studies scholar that gets interviewed through the series, and the link that she makes about prosperity gospel and then systemic abuses is that prosperity gospel implicitly and at times explicitly like teaches this ultimate submission to authority. I am God's representative here on earth. This is and this is what I need. And this is what I'm asking of you. And if I'm God's representative, then I can start making demands of you. And those demands can get increasingly sinister. But they carry with them this authority dynamic and this relationship where there is a clear hierarchy between leader and follower.
Well, no, it's the hierarchy thing. Like that's like we already talked about this last episode, but so it comes back to this same thing where like you don't get to no church board or group of elders that had been elected by the congregation voted to make Brian Houston
right
global head senior pastor or whatever. You get these situations where there's just these men in charge of things, and then they're all buddies and they take care of each other. Like
zero oversight.
Well,
accountability.
they are overseers, but in name only. And so, for example, locally, like we're recording this in Alabama, there's a large megachurch in our state, Church of the Highlands. One of their overseers is Robert Morris, who pastors Gateway Church in Texas, and he recently allegations came out about him sexually abusing a child in the 80s. And I was talking to a friend of mine about this who follows the Highlands News more closely, and they were like, yeah, so I tuned into their online service to see because this happened last week, what was going to be said about it. And because this guy's spoken there, he's, he gets the whole, like the Frank Houston applause situation for him. And the head pastor at Highlands was just like, it's been a tough week.
Jesus.
Been through a lot.
Sure.
And that was it. Like no mention of anything. No, like.
Right. So a big part of the third and fourth episode of the series is about the responses to allegations and then straight up evidence and information and records that come out about Frank Houston's sexual predation spanning decades. And then the responses to when Brian Houston is in charge of Hillsong, and like the response is basically nothing. Like, people can be monsters and nothing really happens. He stays in the church. Everything is kind of swept under the rug. That is juxtaposed, and I don't know if it's done super effectively in the documentary, but alongside that relative silence is the super public shaming that they do of members of the church, students at Hillsong College,
Mhm.
like one of the people who is now good and grown, but she was 19 when she tells a story about being 19 when she gets pregnant, and she's told to stand up in front of the congregation with her boyfriend and apologize. And she talks about how traumatic that was, how it affected her physically as well as emotionally and mentally and spiritually. And and then we get all of these stories coming out from folks who are interviewed about their time at the college, where they have these initial like intake interviews or whatever, where they're asked like, have you ever looked at porn? Have you ever masturbated? What is your sexual history? Da 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 da. And either like nobody's saying anything, and so then, oh, I guess I'm the only one, so I'm not going to say anything, and so then everybody's just lying. Or if they are in individual interview settings and they say, yes, this is my experience, da da da, then they are marked. It's a very like scarlet letter situation where they like, literally get a tag with maybe it is actually like a red dot.
Yes,
I forget,
it's
or
a
a
red
yellow
dot.
dot. Yeah.
Yeah.
Where then people see that they are quote unquote struggling with whatever. And so there is this really glaring counterpoint, this total disconnect between the way that leaders in the church respond to their own abuses, like when someone on that same level of power does something horrible, how we respond to that versus how we respond to teenagers and young adults in our services who are not at the same power level, and how public we are about shaming them and
Right.
and ostracizing them. And I mean, obviously, like that's leaving alone just like what the difference is between like sexual abuse and
Right.
getting pregnant with your boyfriend in a consensual relationship at 19. Like
Right. Yeah.
leaving alone that glaring, like obvious issue. There's this power dynamic that I think like it looks like a big disconnect, but I think it's actually two sides of the same coin. I
Yeah.
think that those responses really work together as a kind of interconnected way to get power, maintain it, carry it forward, wield it,
Yeah, and then there's the weird thing where the reporters kind of say this, and it's sort of implied throughout the documentary that somehow like, why didn't this happen? Why didn't Carl Lentz get to sweep his indiscretion, which was at least in one case was consensual. The other one is mired in all sorts of weird power dynamics of employee employer nanny situation. We talked about that last episode, but like there's this kind of thing of like, why didn't they give Carl the full Hillsong whitewash, which I just found really frustrating. Like, I don't care. Like, the one thing that out of that kind of conversation in the film that I think is interesting, because we never hear from Brian Houston. We never like we see him like all flop sweaty in the interviews with the lawyers and stuff, but we don't get I don't know, him on a beach in the south of France doing the work the way Carl is in Florida. We do see from Carl, I think, and he talks about marriage and all these things, like the way that the ideology around sex and gender and desire is so, it's non-existent. Like, people think like we there's all this stuff about like the stance on homosexuality, the stance on marriage, the stance on gender that these churches take, and how politically vociferous it is, and the real world consequences of that in terms of laws and things. But when you start to scratch, you realize that these are people that are terrified of their own feelings. Like they're and don't know what to do with them. And so they either with the less powerful, they use it as a form of control. So you have to learn to hate your own desire, and and or they don't know how to, because of that, they don't know how to harness it in themselves, and so it comes out in these ways with, Brian Houston spending a mysterious 40 minutes in a hotel room, like, and there's this so it's like they know that these things are powerful, they know these things are ways that power circulates, but they don't have any clear ideology of what to do with it, and it just seems to just sort of like ricochet around, causing havoc in these churches. And it's like, whether it's the self-hatred that is sort of imposed upon these the Hillsong college students, or whether it's the like the just the sort of emptiness behind Brian Houston's eyes in those videos when he's sitting by himself trying to explain himself after everything's broken. So that's what's remarkable to me, and I don't know what to do with that other than to be like, that's like really jacked up, but like
Yeah.
that.
Well, and it also like helps make sense though then of of answering the question of why a church would actually need non-disclosure agreements.
yeah.
And we're going to see that as NDAs and the rules thereof are going to be the NDAs are going to make cameos in several of the documentaries that we talk about, I'm sure.
It's almost more interesting when they don't use an NDA. It's like, you're not even culting right.
It's because then they're really genuine. But we talked a bit in the first episode about how a church comes to look and act like a corporation, and one of the ways that it starts acting like a corporation is creating these corporate safeguards, except that what they're protecting is not trade secrets or, well, in some cases financial documents, I guess, but they're protecting information on a whole other level.
Okay, but hold on a second.
Go.
So there's a line in the thing, like, they're not protecting trade secrets. Like Mike Cosper, shout out to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast, and he says that line, right? They're not protecting trade secrets.
Right.
I think he actually misses something though, because if the entire church is built upon alpha male, don't you want my life, you need more money, Brian Houston, like, what's the secret sauce to Hillsong, right? What's the secret sauce to Hillsong New York? What's the secret sauce to Gateway Church in Texas? Like, well, it's the dude. It's the charismatic guy up there. And so the NDA to protect the dude when he's screwed up is actually protecting the trade secret. Like, I've heard a megachurch pastor say this before, like in front of the whole crowd. Like, the language of like, I have to be like, quote, above reproach, because I know that if I do something and it gets out there, that he literally said this whole thing could fall apart at any moment.
One of the interesting things about Pentecostalism, or just this kind of ideological framework and dogmatic approach in the first place, is that on one hand, because it is so again, at one level, really egalitarian, right? Anybody can become a preacher. Anybody can, at least once upon a time. I think now maybe there are probably like things you have to do. I mean, there's a college you have to go to or whatever, but
maybe
sometimes. But I mean, that was part of the whole vibe early on in like early Pentecostalism, was that anyone who is called can become a minister. So anybody can do it. There isn't, and on the other hand, like, so the secret sauce then is God's calling. And that is, I mean, they talk a few times about that axiom, like God doesn't call, I always mix it up. God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. So like there's a calling first and then there's a qualification. But like that whole idea of anybody can do it, but you have to have this like holy, divine, special calling from God is such it is so conveniently personalized that it masks all of these other structural elements that I think that you're hitting on. That's a really good point.
Yeah, like if you want to be called to the ministry in like a mainline Protestant church, you have to like, well, first of all, you have to get like a degree, and then you have to like go through ordination, and they ask you all these questions, and then they like it's a whole process. But all Carl Lentz had to do was show up at Hillsong College. All Brian Houston had to do was like be born and have a terrible father. Like it's,
Terrible father.
and you'll see these, like I've seen, I can give you the riff on like, Moses being called by God, and he's like, I can't speak, and God's like, I'll speak for you. Like that's the model, right?
Well, it's also what makes sense of horrible leaders, right? Like that's the entire, like that's how people scramble, like media outlets and culture critics and political talking heads who were convinced that Donald Trump couldn't possibly win an election, and they went like fishing for like how can this be, and how can evangelicals support someone terrible, and da 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 da, and so much of that rhetoric inside evangelical communities is God can use this broken vessel.
Oh yeah,
And so I mean, I think it's a brilliant kind of rhetorical two-step, and it's also what makes it so insidious.
It's like, how do you claim authority when there's no like process to give authority? And so you invent this untestable, completely unempirical way of claiming authority that really behind it is about like, well, he is about having the proper amount of capital, and having the proper people behind you with money, and having the proper back. It's because his father built a church, which we don't really know exactly how that happened from the documentary, but builds this church, and the music makes a crap ton of money, right? Hillsong's music does so well, and is sort of dominates all these other mega churches, and then that allows them to grow, and then it continues to grow. And so it's like the authority is like granted to be from God, but is actually just from like, there's two ways to have power. This is like this is the thing that activist friends have said to me, like there's two ways to have power: money and people. And so when your church gets big enough, you've got both.
Well, and it's how you keep hold of the myth of meritocracy inside of a super nepotistic space. So after Frank Houston plants the church in Sydney, important side note, like the reason he left New Zealand for Sydney in the first place was because of the rumblings of his sexual abuses started to get around the church. And so to dodge those, he leaves, he goes to Sydney, he builds a church, and very quickly, Brian Houston becomes his number one. In just a couple of years, he becomes the associate pastor, and then begins to kind of build his own brand. In the vein of like, okay, so all of these abuses are going on. How do people respond to them? I just want to make sure that we kind of hit some nutshells of what happened and what kinds of responses there were. There was a royal commission that was established, which is sort of like, that's Australia's like internally initiated like highest court in the land, right?
We don't have a royal commission. Do we have an equivalent to this? Like a Senate hearing? Or that like?
Yeah, I guess maybe it would be like a Senate hearing, something like that. But a royal commission is, but then this also has like judicial.
This is like the
power.
The 9/11 commission.
Yeah, like,
or the January 6th commission.
If the Supreme Court and a Senate commission, like a Senate hearing, could kind of be merged, maybe.
It's almost like our branches aren't the best form ever.
So a royal commission is established in 2013 to look into institutional responses to child abuse. This is when, and this isn't just about Hillsong or megachurches by any stretch. This is when information about the long history of child abuse and sexual abuse inside the Catholic Church is coming to light. Yeah. This is when the Boy Scouts, that's right, started getting looked into. So that royal commission happens. The investigation spans a handful of years. They interview thousands of survivors, and there are like a few dozen case studies that they look into on religious institutions. And we can actually link that section if you think it would be useful. I read it and it's really interesting, but this is when, like, in that commission is where several of Frank Houston's victims come forward and offer information, one of which is really, really important to the report. The response to that from the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, he issues an apology, but like several senior members of state were also affiliated with Hillsong.
Yeah.
So
including Morrison.
So no real action gets taken. Frank Houston pays that victim, who goes under the like pseudonym AHA. He pays him like $10,000. Brian Houston accuses him of tempting his father, thinks that it was just a one-off, Cut to when Brian Houston is in charge of Hillsong, when Carl Lentz is becoming who Carl Lentz became, like when all of that is happening and everything is firing on all cylinders, Brian Houston has, like, there are a couple of allegations that are made where he is sending inappropriate texts to female congregants, where he shows up in like a woman's hotel room at a conference under very dubious and ill articulated circumstances. But there was a combination of like anxiety meds and alcohol. Like, he was not on top of his game.
Also, the amount of times that they just like nonchalantly talk about alcohol seems like this is not the Pentecostalism I knew.
Right. Well,
like, anyways,
later
that alone would be.
Later he says that like my doctor looked into it and I do not exhibit the signs of an alcoholic. I mean, it's just like the extent to, I feel like so many of the sentences are coming out of my mouth like molasses because there's just so much. There are so many. So we will leave it to listeners to follow all of the rabbit holes. There are so many allegations. There are so many abuses that are happening, but the responses are very easy to talk about because those are just like, it either didn't happen or it was a one-time thing or this was a fluke, whatever. Or if you are a person who is not as powerful and needs taken down or wrong, then you are, I guess, someone struggling with your faith. Or if you're Carl Lentz, who's like in this kind of liminal space of sort of power, but not really.
Middle manager in the Hillsong empire.
That's right. Then you are exhibiting narcissistic behavior, et cetera, et cetera.
That line coming from him.
Sure.
With that haircut.
Again with the hair.
He's got, all right. He's got Ric Flair hair. Like old Ric Flair hair. There might be one more wrestling reference. I apologize to our listeners. You are a dog with a
bone today about hair, Michael. I didn't think about Yeah. So the other issue that starts to come to light that begins to be a problem for Brian Houston is the financial misdeeds that begin to surface. Hillsong's own bookkeeper, Natalie Moses, starts to ask questions internally. She gets fired when she does so. So she files a suit about their unethical payment practices, not least of which were huge payments to Brian Houston and Bobby Houston, his wife, accounts held overseas, the stuff that church money was paying for that seemed very personally beneficial. He has, of course, like called these allegations categorically wrong. But just as of last year in the Australian Parliament, like they talk about Hillsong's financial crimes, like
Yeah.
that, and that documents have shown Hillsong to owe $80 million more than it reports, and so on and so on. So the reason that Brian Houston finally resigns, this is, I mean, a year before even that report. This is in 2022. He doesn't make a formal statement. He goes on vacation instead. So maybe he is doing the work in the south of France. You don't know. But he had run the church for 45 years. But then, like Carl Lentz had left just a couple years before. Things are already really sticky. And there's a lot of drama. And then, and also too, I mean, the rise of social media where like, Hillsong, like the Hillsong college students and the former members who are talking about these instances of shaming, sexual shaming, homophobia, misogyny, and so on and so on and so on. Like they begin to form their own online communities and start sharing their own stories.
The same tools that like built Hillsong become the tools for these ex-Hillsongers to build.
100%.
Yeah, the Hillsong College stuff was interesting because the way there was one person who says, I knew I wasn't going to progress any further, and the idea that like of Hillsong College as this place where you would start a kind of like Hillsong career is just, it's fascinating. And then like you see the idea of like almost volunteering at a megachurch in order to then hopefully one day get on staff. And you see like, oh, so-and-so becomes, if you have this like multi-site church, like this guy becomes the head pastor of this new campus we're opening up. And it's because, well, how did they start off? Well, they were like a small group leader at this campus for years. And then they like gave all of this free labor to the church. And now they're getting, now they're moving halfway across the state to start this new camp. And it's like, that's how it's and it's again the same. There's no like obvious way that one goes about getting a job at Hillsong other than paying them money to go to this college and or also volunteering a crap ton at the church for free, which is what keeps these churches running. I mean, the labor issues that these people talk about at Hillsong in terms of the hours they put in and all that is that's like the way you do this. And maybe you throw them a fancy party once a year or twice a year with like where you bring in a clean comedian and feed them a bunch of like good catering to try to say thank you. And you tell them that this is how you find your purpose in life, by giving us your labor for free. But like, that's it. Like they say like volunteer one service and then come to the next service. Right. And so it's this very weird labor, pool that no one knows how to get anywhere. And so to hear that whole thing at Hillsong College was just sort of like, it's very bizarre, and I can see how it's very unsettling. And then suddenly, once you start talking, because in that mode, everyone is your competition. And so it's at the point that they start no longer worrying about, like, that's why you have to tell who's struggling, because that means that they don't get to do whatever the thing, like they don't get to lead the next Bible study because they're struggling and you're not, obviously. So
well, and when you think about the role of unpaid volunteers and overworked employees, there are creepy resonances with the general, generationally specific, which is never a great look, logic that now complains about millennials being in a tough economic spot because they just don't want to work hard.
We're doing this podcast for free, by the way.
Like the way that the generation that is able to grow, like Brian Houston's generation of economic access, like the way that things were structured,
right?
And then how that began to play out in the church, I think is pretty striking. And I think that we should talk about how that continues to translate now in a broader sense, not just economically, but again, like as consumers of media that tell stories about religious traditions like Hillsong. Because I was looking at an NPR piece from last year on the fact that church attendance and people who identify as, Christian church like church attendance has gone down,
Mhm.
but mega church, like the presence of mega churches, which are defined as churches that have more than 2,000 members. They're mostly non-denominational, but that can, it depends. But over 2,000 members, those churches are growing. And so there's a really interesting kind of way that these numbers are moving in inverse directions. And I think that, that could be interesting to talk about. I mean, at Hillsong's height, they've got 30, like 30 countries have locations all across the world. There are 150,000 people in services a week. Now that has shrunk, there's like only a handful of US locations now, but the music is still everywhere. And the phenomenon, like regardless of, because I mean, part of our point is that none of this exists in a vacuum, right? None
Right.
of this is just a one message inside of a singular bottle. This is a phenomenon that is reflective of a bigger cultural moment. And the stories that we tell about it are also reflective of a specific moment. And the way that we receive those stories, I think, are also part of that
Yeah.
dynamic. So,
Well, and it's part of like a larger economic trend of consolidation where, like video game studios are consolidating, Xbox, Microsoft just bought a bunch of video game studios up over the last few years and consolidating it. And, universities are consolidating as big schools are growing and smaller, directional universities are closing and cutting costs and losing. Like, I remember years ago, I mean, like 15 years ago, talking to a sociologist who studied religion and church growth and all this stuff, and he was trying to he was this when this trend was really ramping up, and he was trying to explain it. And he's like, the only thing that looks similar to this is the growth of flagship state universities, like in terms of like the way the curve looks and the growth. And you think about these corporations that are a part of this sort of, a lot of them, you have the charismatic CEO as a certain kind of figure that looks a lot like the connections and of the CEO pastor and the CEO of an actual corporation, and the ways that those leadership, like that's a whole nother podcast, but like
totally.
the leadership rhetoric and the whole leadership industry that has drawn on, that is caught on in both in business and in churches, Christian churches, and these is like it's all muddled up together, right? And
Mhm.
so this isn't just about Hillsong or even just about mega churches. It's about the ways we talk about how do large institutions get built. They get built by brilliant men, right?
Yeah.
Like that's how they get built.
Well, and so, I mean, in relation to our specific social and political moment, the ties that Christian leadership, Protestant Christian leadership specifically, has to political power, of course, like is something that a lot of people are talking about, but again, like it is often something that is a story about specific men, specific personalities,
Right.
instead of these structures and these conglomerates, these consortiums working as these just like almost amorphous, but then really specifically motivated entities. And so, I mean, Trump invites Brian Houston as a special guest to the White House at one point. That is not insignificant or coincidental. Like in a broader sense and in a more recent sense, I've been reading about, I'm sure you have too, that new bill that Jeff Landry, he's the governor of Louisiana, and he just signed a new bill that mandates the 10 Commandments be posted in public schools.
Yes. Yeah.
Punchline, religion never exists in a vacuum, right? So the person who introduced that bill, she's a Republican representative. Her name is Dodie Horton. She also wrote a bill last summer that mandates, in God we trust be posted in public school classrooms. Yeah, so that was passed last year. She had introduced that. She's also behind this 10 Commandments bill. She's also, though, one of the primary people behind a don't say gay bill for Louisiana. I mean, we were familiar with the one in Florida that prohibits public school teachers from being able to talk about gender or sexual identity. And now they're waiting on Landry to sign that into law. So, the idea that an expression of religious faith is ever separate from expressions or prohibitions of expression of other forms of identification, like gender, like sexuality, like histories of racist power structures, like any of the elements that we just part of the ethers we exist inside of. Religion is never we like to think about religion as something kind of set apart. If it's sacred, then it's over here and it's protected that way. That's why it's tax exempt. That's why there are protections legally and intellectually and in all sorts of ways around it. But it's also never removed from these other issues. And I think that if we focused more on these structural dynamics rather than the people who animate them or who reflect them, because certainly Dodie Horton doesn't exist in a vacuum either.
Yeah.
And so I think if we shifted that focus, then a lot of these things that don't seem to make sense make so much more sense.
And I think if you get some of this in the documentary, the idea that they're religion is supposed to do these things. That's what I kind of walk away from it with is well, what do you think a church is supposed to do with its money? Right? There's an assumption there. If it's not supposed to buy Versace ties for Brian Houston, what do we think the we of the social body, what do we think they're supposed to be doing? And then because there's this way that religion is a kind of as my kids would say, it's OP. It's this overpowered category where it completely so there can be no there's nowhere for an overworked Hillsong volunteer or staffer to go file a labor complaint. It's very hard, right? Because immediately it's a church, right? There are specific exemptions in U.S. law for churches in terms of hiring practices, firing practices, labor practices of all sorts. They're allowed to discriminate in certain ways. And so same thing with finances. Like I said, it's tax exempt. There's no the same kind of regulations that would apply to the regulations that would apply to a corporation don't apply to a megachurch. And so they can use practices like NDAs and marketing and have built basically PR shops inside their church and act like corporations, but they have none of the responsibilities of reporting. They're not publicly traded, right? If you give them gifts, you're not actually buying shares in Hillsong. That's my dream. Private equity, getting involved in mega churches. But so once you get that religion stamp, and I think this is a thing we'll come back to again and again, is that the law, when it comes to real illegal abusive behavior of various sorts, the law kind of runs aground on oh, it's a church. I mean, I don't know.
Right. We could plug here too. I think that we should link in this show notes Leslie Durrow Smith's book, Compromising Positions,
Yes.
because I think it is such a brilliant and very like eminently readable, super accessible examination of how what seems incomprehensible on its face. This person's career was ended because of sex scandal X. This person's career was catapulted because of same sex scandal, like in a different context. Like how that can happen, why we seem to care when certain people have affairs and why we don't seem to care when other people have affairs, how all of that plays out in political theater.
I mean,
It's
that
yeah,
happens in this documentary, right?
that's right.
Like the end of the documentary is like this obvious thing. I mean, one of the reporters even says like, "I think Carl paid for what he did." To you, like
Well, and it also, I mean, even that idea becomes still this narrative about sin and repentance, but just like hero's quest, hero's journey that
Yes.
like runs into conflict, and then there's some kind of lesson learned.
that was the most uncomfortable part of this documentary was the number of times I found myself identifying with Carl Lentz and being
Oops.
like, "Wait, no,
Is it
wait."
because of his new hair? His
Yeah,
new
he
hair.
cut his hair.
No, he grew it out.
Well, then he cut it again.
My-
Now it's cut.
Oh, is it?
Yes, because
Oh.
well, there's a whole like okay, and this is but I did want to get to this though. Like the
His
whole
hair?
Carl has paid,
Yeah.
and he paid by working at a weird desk in a weird advertising gig in Sarasota. And then Laura, quote, lost everything. We don't even know what the everything was. Like, what was her job? How much was she paid? Like, what does that even look like? And I think, but the end where it's sort of, you have Brian Houston, who is sort of like shouting into the void in this very sad looking Facebook videos. It's like, look at this sad boomer, right? And then Laura doesn't leave Carl.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it clicked for me that like Laura didn't leave because they wanted back in. Like if Laura leaves, she's not getting back into evangelicalism. Like she's done, right? And if Laura leaves, Carl's pretty much done. And so he puts on his sackcloth and ashes of long hair and goes to Sarasota where one
great.
goes to lament.
It's not great.
And then we've already mentioned this last episode, comes back and they have they have a podcast now, and
Yeah.
I'm 3 episodes into it, and he's like, and him and Laura are talking about the past, and he's interviewing his kids about the past and about this whole situation, and his hair's back short again, and he's doing it not in a network of mostly black pastors, and he's not at a church, but kind of online in this way. And it's the comeback. The comeback is here, and you realize like that's like, in a certain way, from a certain angle, Brian Houston got completely worked. Like Carl Lentz, in the end, Carl Lentz won because he got Brian. Like Brian is off being like, I mean, he's trying, but he's in a pretty sad state, and Carl's back.
Okay, so
And he's hot again, and he's cool again.
okay, I don't disagree with you. I hear that hot take, and I can absorb that. I think ultimately, like, I don't know why Laura Lentz decided to stay or not. I know that Brian and Bobby Houston have their own website now, which is fascinating to look at. I do not want to link that in the show notes, but I'm just going to like drop it for people
I'm
to.
just once again Googling it. Right
Oh
now.
my God. Like the imagery of like, here's Bobby's section that is, and then the imagery of his is all very like broy and sporty, and hers is very relational. And I mean, the gender dynamics are there. Like all of it is a carryover into their next act too. I don't know how successful it's going to be. I don't know that I have a lot to say about that. Which of those men ultimately did okay for themselves or didn't, or who won or who lost. I don't know if I have a clear answer to that. I do know that a lot of church members who entered that space in good faith got categorically fucked.
Oh, yes.
So
Yes.
I do think that like in the, and I guess that's what remains so
But-
just something to pay attention to of like
Yes.
what the stories that we tell, how we receive them, and how it so quickly and easily turns into like
Well, and
these guys.
I guess my punchline to that is that to me, the ultimate point of the documentary might have been to get Carl Lentz to give Carl Lentz the space for the comeback.
Well,
because they worked so closely
Mhm.
with the one of the director or producer had been connected to Hillsong at one point. He like texted Carl, and that's how the whole thing starts. So like the documentary by the end, and sort of like comparing these two, like showing Brian Houston being interviewed by prosecutors, and then showing Carl with his family in their screened-in pool in Sarasota. That kind of ending for me was like erasing all the people who got fucked and paving the way for Carl to make a comeback. And then lo and behold, 2 weeks ago, there's the new podcast, and his hair is short again, and away we go. And he's turning the whole first 3 episodes are about this whole incident.
Yeah. And it's so interesting too, because in the podcast, they're like, I don't know if that, I mean, they kind of distance themselves from the documentary a little bit. So I don't know that they would think that it's like super generous to them, but no.
It got the job done.
Got the job done. Okay. So on that note,
We've got the job done now.
Michael.
Yeah.
Tell me what your cult favorite is. Do we have anything that we can like? Let's create something nice out of this.
This isn't very nice.
Hellscape of abuse and ashes.
Well, my cult favorite is a kind of a hellscape.
Oh, good. Okay.
My cult favorite.
Never mind, everybody.
This week is it's actually a video game, Dead Space, which was remade in 2020 last year, 2023. It was a remake of the original game, came out like 2008. And so they remade it for all the new Xboxes. And I bought my kids an Xbox last Christmas, which means I can now play Xbox for the first time in like decades. And this game has been haunting me for years since the first one came out, because the plot is basically there's this giant mineral extracting space station that's cracking a planet open deep in space to withdraw minerals. And in the process, unearths this weird artifact called the Marker. And lo and behold, and you're going to this space station to like do some repairs. And it turns out the whole thing is like completely fucked and full of aliens that are kind of these zombie aliens. And also your like love of your life was a doctor on this ship, and you're trying to find her and save her. And meanwhile, there is a cult that worships this Marker and worships these aliens as the next stage of human evolution. And that cult was founded by an anthropologist named Michael Altman.
No.
Yes, which is my name. You didn't know.
Well, you weren't sure at the beginning.
No, I wasn't. So I am. It is the game is like 12 chapters long. I'm on chapter 7. I'm getting into, it was this wild moment while I walked into this room, and there's a giant poster that says all praise to Altman. So I screenshotted that, and I'm going to put that on my phone background.
You loved that.
Yeah. If anyone is listening who can figure out how to get me a copy of that poster for my office.
Okay, as your friend, I'm just going to remind you that you found it troubling when you were relating to Carl Lentz. I want to keep you honest about that.
Yeah, I did find
not
it
let you go to
like Carl Lentz. It was one of those road not taken moments. So yeah,
just as you bask in your glory.
It's available, I think, for everything. And it's on Xbox Game Pass if you have that subscription. It is quite fun. I'm slowly making my way through it. It's the kind of game you can like just play for 20 minutes if you only have a little bit of time, put it away. It's not online. You don't have to play other people. You can be really bad at it or put it on easy mode. So for the story, but I'm looking forward to seeing when Michael Altman is actually revealed to me in the game. So I don't know the story. I'm just going in blind. So yeah, that's my cult favorite of what I do when my partner's asleep and my kids are asleep and I'm alone. I can fire up the Xbox.
Aw. My cult favorite is kind of a sentimental one, and I'm almost never sentimental. So I'm gonna peak early and then just
It's all cynicism from here, folks.
so, there's no place to go but down. This is getting released in July, but at the time of this moment in this recording, it's Pride Month, everybody. We're in late June. And last weekend, I just want to give a shout out to people who are doing the work, because in the Hillsong documentary, there was a lot of hay made, quite rightly, about the fact that, it looks like there's a diverse community, but in reality, the way that power works creates this very white, very straight, very male persona and presence, pulling all of the strings. And unlike in productive counter distinction to that sort of structure is our groups like the Birmingham Bevy. So last weekend I went to their Pride event, and it was at this fun little bar in Birmingham where there were really cute bartenders, and one of them gave me I got a jalapeno tequila espresso martini.
Wow, that's a lot of adjectives.
Exactly.
I
But
guess jalapeno is a noun.
yeah, but she was really cute,
Wow.
and she gave me a free drink. And so
Yeah.
I love her for that. And the group of people that we were hanging out with was like from 20 nothings to septuagenarians, all across the racial, sexual, gender spectrum. And I was just having like a little moment of hanging out in the rainbow.
That's one of those there are these moments when you're like, this is Alabama, y'all. Like
Family time is
that
important.
happened in Birmingham, Alabama. Like that's what I
You
like to
can
know.
have fun
Yeah.
with your family in the Deep South.
Yeah.
So yeah, people are doing the work of not always perfectly, but trying to make
See,
space.
if more churches had jalapeno, I lost track already.
My dude, there is an espresso martini like competition happening right now. I don't know if it's for the week or what the deal
An
is in
espresso martini
Birmingham.
competition.
Yeah, in Birmingham, where you go and like you can scan the QR code and like
Oh,
vote
okay.
for your favorite
Yeah.
espresso martini. And this one was not made with vodka. It was made with jalapeno infused tequila, which sounds very strange, but it was brilliant. Brilliant.
One of my favorite
So
drinks.
thank you, Lumbar and cute waitress who served me that drink.
One of my favorite drinks is still the jalapeno infused thing you gave me. That I gave you some jalapenos and you gave me back.
Oh yeah,
The frozen,
the base burner.
The base burner. Yeah,
that's right.
That was amazing.
Those are.
I have more jalapenos. I would give them to you to infuse more cocktails. I just picked some yesterday from the garden.
Terrific.
Thanks for listening to Cult Favorite. Join us. You can subscribe to the podcast on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And when you subscribe, be sure to leave a rating and a review. You can also follow us on X or Instagram at Cult Favorite Pod. We would love to hear your feedback. DM us or leave a comment on this episode in Spotify. Special thanks to the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Alabama for production assistance. See you next time.